Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Product Tank, to the March Product Tank. We are your organizing team, and I hope you can see my screen. We are the organizing team. So Michelle, myself, and Swanand, who's also on the line. Anya and Eva, we're all from Heidelberg. We work at Springer Nature by Chance. We are organizing the Product Tank in Heidelberg. We try to do virtual sessions and in-person sessions. Hopefully we will be organizing in-person sessions soon as well. So the Product Tank is basically the world's largest product community. I'm sure you've heard that already. Let me just let in a few more people. It was funded in 2010, and now it's present in more than 200 cities around the world. It's basically a community organized by product people for product people. So with the aim of exchanging experiences, learning from each other, sharing new processes, new concepts, etc. But mostly it's just really a community to learn and get to know each other and learn from each other, basically. So our mission is to help making product people more successful by getting people together and promoting the opportunity to exchange learning and experiences with each other. And we're always happy to get in more people involved. We are happy to have you to speak at a Product Tank. We're also looking always for hosts and sponsors. You can also write for the mindaproduct.com. You can become a Mind the Product member and get advantage of all the content and information that they always have available and share. So just check it out on mindtheproduct.com to learn more. We are also very much always looking for people to talk at Product Tank events and also in person. As I mentioned, we're located in Heidelberg, and we are happy to start to organize more in-person events. So if I would also give the opportunity to create a local community more than it is now. And so if you're interested in speaking in a local event, just reach out to us. Or just if you want to organize any other sort of product events, just feel free to reach out to us. But enough about us. We are here tonight to hear from Tim Herbig on how to balance long-term metrics and OKRs using the product strategy metrics sandwich. This is a new concept for me, so I'm looking forward to hear more. I think Tim doesn't really need an introduction, but I'll give an introduction anyway. So he's a product management coach and consultant, and he writes and speaks a lot about product strategy, OKRs, product discovery, and also how to connect the dots between these and everything else related to product. He provides a lot of hands-on content, services and courses. I've been part of one of his workshops, so I can really recommend that. And yeah, I think I'll just pass on the baton to Tim, and I'm looking forward to learning more about strategy metrics sandwich from you. Thanks, Tim, for being here tonight.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. Let me try to get along with the most nerve-wracking moment of every virtual presentation, which is if my screen sharing works. So please just give me a quick sign that you can see my slides. Quick thumbs up. Cool. Awesome. And again, as I mentioned, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today with you, in spirit at least, even though not physically. And yeah, as Michelle really said, today I want to talk about there's so many interesting relationships in product management between those various domains, the various artifacts we like to use. And the relationship I want to take a closer look at today is OKRs as a very practical, tactical execution tool, and what kind of other elements it might be connected to, and what other elements it might benefit from to make the OKRs more useful, more meaningful, and to make sure that you can design OKRs that go beyond just mirroring business KPIs or backlog items. So we're going to try to look at this and try to balance things out with the aforementioned idea of, does that all fit together in some kind of sandwich, which is of course more of a model that it will be a framework. So when we talk about goals and metrics, and specifically in the context of strategy, like one term might come to your mind. It certainly does come to my mind quite often, which is that, well, a list of goals is not a strategy. So what do goals have to do with strategy? And I think it's fair to say that a list of goals is not a strategy. It's not a replacement of a strategy, at least not in my experience. It rarely allows you to get the benefits from what strategy is supposed to do. And we will talk more about this a little bit later. But what if strategy actually requires goals to work? So what if goals around a strategy can actually amplify the strategy, both its creation, but also its implementation? The thing is that when I talk about these kind of goals I want to bridge today, I want to connect to today, is that I'm not talking about those various goals, the various dashboards that might be in most companies. Right? I think in most situations, there's certainly no shortage of goals, right? You probably have pirate metrics and OKRs and KPIs and North Stars and balanced scorecard and whatever you might have. So there's in most companies no shortage of goals. The question is always, is the goal useful or is it also meaningful? And again, I think there's a strong correlation between the usefulness, meaningfulness of goals and the quality of a company's and also a team's product strategy, which is the aspect I want to look at closer. So we're focusing on the product strategy aspect. And again, I think goals can have an inspiring influence on the product strategy, but they can definitely also act as an implementation guide, right? I think that's an important part to consider. And from this kind of loose connecting the dots kind of exercise that was mostly going on in my head, emerged this idea of like, well, can you just like put things together? Can't like the strategy just sit in the middle of some kind of interesting sandwich when it can be just sandwiched between goal types like a North Star metric and OKRs? And before we dive deeper into many things, I want to like lay some groundwork for what do I think of these terms? Like, what do I mean by that? And so I think, again, you have this influencing force and this implementing function for some kind of goals, whereas a North Star metric, which we will take a closer look at in a second, really is about measuring the experienced value by your audience in a strong relationship to your product vision, right? It's like, it's not really about, it's one of these metrics where it's not about achieving the metric, it's about the journey to getting there, to growing it. But a product strategy, on the other hand, right, it does have with a specific time horizon. It's not just about randomly following and trying to improve something. You want to make specific choices around the most important parts of certain strategy patterns that are really universally true, no matter the framework or the flavor you subscribe to. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the OKRs or really any other more tactical goal-setting framework, but we're going to focus on OKRs for today. And they really are very much a point-in-time goal compared to the North Star metric. It's not as ongoing or as evergreenish. It's about a point-in-time progress through holistic metrics that look at the progress towards the strategic choice through more than just business or performance KPIs. So that's the setup. And let's look at these various ingredients of the strategy, of the sandwich, sorry. Of course, also the ingredients of the strategy. But let's start with the North Star metric, right? And again, it's kind of the problem is, which is not limited to the North Star metric. It's kind of a universally used term, right? Everything is North Star, everything is an outcome, everything is whatever. So whenever I talk about concepts like this, I like to go back to its roots, trying to understand, well, what was the actual intention behind establishing something like the North Star metric? And of course, there's the obvious meaning, like the literal meaning of giving orientation and helping people to navigate. But again, if you go back to the original quote unquote creator, or like at least the person who coined the concept the first, it's interesting to look at what was the actual intention behind it, right? And the earliest reference I always find myself going back to is from Sean Ellis, who's an author of the book Hacking Growth, and who also was an early VP of product, VP growth at Dropbox and Eventbrite and all these fancy Silicon Valley companies. And he described the North Star metric basically as the single metric that captures the core value that your product delivers to customers. Let that sink in. Now I would be interested, what kind of North Star metrics would work for your product, right? What would let me know in the chat, or let us know in the chat. Type some kind of North Star metrics that you think really help you capture the core value that your product delivers to customers. Drop some examples in the chat. If you don't want to share them from your product, feel free to use other examples. But I'm curious. Don't be shy. It's not about right or wrong. Just like what would you see as a metric that measures the experience value by your customers or users? I like these first example because they give kind of a nice idea. Like the ones mentioned from Google, sales revenue, number of visits. That's a quite common one, right? That's a common North Star metric you see. But the problem is that does not really indicate, or it doesn't describe the experience value, right? It's a business KPI. Right? It's more about level of interoperability, right? Depending on the product, if your product's main vision is to unify enterprise system landscapes, then that very well might be a North Star metric worth focusing on. I think that's the misconception you see very often, that people just look at business KPIs and say ARR is our North Star metric. That's what we align on because you want to have recurring revenue. But again, it doesn't really capture the value. Now, the question is very often like, how can you land on the North Star metric? And the good news is there's so many different paths you could take trying to get closer to a North Star metric that works for your product, for your company. So that's a question teams very often have, rightfully so. Like, how do I get started? How do I actually do this? Let me jump back to Keynote here. So where to start? And I think there are two, like so often, there are two different paths. You could do like a bottom-up approach, right? You can basically start to form a KPI tree and just list all the very tactical KPIs you're utilizing. You try to map them up. Like, why are you measuring them? What are the patterns among them? You could try to ladder up from all the business KPIs to technical KPIs you have all the way to a North Star metric. Or you could start to approach it from the top down. And I think a very, very interesting source is the product vision. Because if you look at the loose definitions, the product internet seems to agree on between the product vision and the North Star metric, is that the product vision is about describing the aspirational future and the experienced value you want to create for your target audience through your product or service, right? That's probably a big misconception I see very often. People think the product vision is about describing the product. It's not about that. It's about the change it creates for your users. And as we said, the North Star metric is the single metric that best captures the core value. So what is the overlap between the product vision and the North Star metric? Do you see something? What do they have in common? What attribute? Value, yeah. Value to the customers. Exactly. That's the thing. And such an often overlooked thing. Of course, if your product vision in your company is treated as a list of features of what you becoming the market leader, that doesn't really focus on the value for the users. But if you take this actual vision approach, it gets a little bit more interesting. So I think the vision is it's a helpful source for this more like top-down inspirational starting point for figuring out which North Star metric to focus on. Now, it's always interesting to make that a little bit more tangible. And one of the companies that have been at the forefront of evangelizing this actual approach to the North Star metric has been Amplitude, of course, with a selfish thought, because they're an analytics tool. And the better the more you want to know about the North Star metric, the better your analytics system needs to be. But that doesn't take away from the quality of content they're delivering. And so in this example, you could see the statement on the left, and it's worth debating if that's actually a vision, if it's more of a mission, but you get the idea. Let's run with the example. So they say, basically on this level, they want to empower every company to turn their product vision into reality and grow by easily answering questions on what drives behavior, empowering a better customer experience. And the way I like to approach of figuring out, okay, how would I go from a vision to the potential North Star metrics, is to figure out what are the key attributes in my product vision statement. And in this case, it's clearly, well, it's about helping people easily answer questions through the data we provide in our analytics tool, meaning that at the highest level, at least at the time of this writing, their North Star metric was the number of weekly users for whom Amplitude answered at least one question. They even have a more interesting acronym for that. They call them weekly learning users, WLUs, right? They just make it more tangible. They make it more, and you can see that for Amplitude, it's not about a given number of weekly learning users. It's about continuously growing that number because that aligns with their vision and what they're trying to achieve. And you can do the same thing when you look at the vision of your product, which you hopefully have. Figure out what are the key attributes in there, what the key changes you're trying to create, and then think about how could I measure that? And of course, there's an interesting dynamic that when you think of a North Star, it's easy to say there's one North Star metric, and it's easy to say it's only one of these metrics exists. But I think particularly in the larger your company is, the more layers there oftentimes are to North Star-like metrics you might want to utilize. Because if you go back to the idea, okay, a North Star metric closely correlates with a vision you might have. You realize, well, in the company, in the larger company, you definitely have multiple visions. You have a company vision, and probably every product has its own vision, rightfully so, because every product has its own journey of continuously delivering and building value. And I love this idea of, like, to make it more obvious. I found the story from Gibson Biddle, who many of you might already know, also know from the internet. And he is once quoted in an article talking about how the team of Netflix utilized the North Star metric, right? And they said, look, ultimately they figured out people who need to have 3 DVDs in their queue, that became the North Star for a given team. And I think he's talking about a certain activation. So it's more about the onboarding / growth back then. I think what's so interesting, or what that really reveals, that you could argue, well, okay, that is a experience value for this type of user at this stage, because the better the algorithm, the recommendation, the onboarding algorithm, the more DVDs I can have in the more good DVDs, the more good movies I have in my queue, right? That's the experience value of a great recommendation, but it's hardly the North Star metric of Netflix as a company as a whole, because I don't know the exact metric they use, but if you would play this through, probably a company-wide North Star metric for Netflix as a whole would probably be something like the number of hours binge watched per week, like binge watching, indicating that what you're watching is so great that you like to continue it, or a certain recommendation, whatever they're using. But it's certainly not, the value of Netflix is not measured by number of DVDs in your queue. And that just makes it so tangible that there can be multiple levels of that, like different North Star metric kind of metrics, right? And I want to play this through with you a little bit, because I brought this fictional example with me, which I want to play through and use as an example to look at some of these other artifacts of the sandwich as well. And it's a company we're going to call Mindful Movement, which is really a digital fitness app, right? Nothing fancy, just a made-up example. And they are aimed at parents. So if you look at the company vision for Mindful Movement, they say, well, parents can get closer to the best version of themselves on their own time, anytime, anywhere. One North Star metric for that could be, well, the number of weeks spent in a fulfilling shape by parents, right? You could probably quantify that even further, multiple drivers, but that could be the ultimate expression, like, well, and I get the value out of this product, the amount of time I spend in fulfilling shape. And of course, like, Mindful Movement consists of multiple product areas, right? It's not just one big app. They've grown quite substantially. So they have a personal strength training product, but they also have a mental fitness product. Not a product, but a mental fitness product. Sorry for the typo. So maybe for the personal strength training, the vision is, well, you don't need a gym to be held accountable for individualized workouts. And they could say the share of completed 6-week training cycles. Right? If people achieve the goal in these cycles, that's the experience value. But maybe for the product, for the mental health product, which is the area we will zoom in a little bit more on, is that, well, parents feel like confident athletes about approaching new physical challenges to achieve their greatest fitness goals. That's the vision for this product, which perfectly ties in with the company vision of Mindful Movement, right? That's what it's about, like tying in and being part of the broader vision. Maybe the North Star metric here could be, well, we know we have achieved this vision, or we're contributing to this vision if we're growing the number of previously anxious users now performing a sport or action they previously felt blocked to do, right? And so just to, again, go back to those various ingredients we're talking about today, I think it's worth talking about the various time horizons and the things that are to keep that in mind. So the North Star metric, again, it's not about hitting a certain goal or a certain metric or certain threshold with the North Star metric. It's about continuously compounding the measurement of the experience value. Whereas the product strategy choice, right, where we make those explicit choices about these various parts of the strategy, have a more tangible time horizon. And depending on the maturity, the life cycle of your product, this might range from 6 to 18 months. And OKRs, on the other hand, then, of course, are about giving you guidance, ideally on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, to see if you're making progress in the right direction, as in towards your strategic choices. So the more we look to the right, really, it's about these are guideposts for learning whether your strategy works, your strategic choice works. That's what it's about, right? You don't want to do OKRs for the sake of it. OKRs are supposed to work as a guidepost. Now, I want to unpack the idea of strategy just a little bit, because it's one of these terms, again, which is easily confused, has so many different interpretations. If you'd really boil it down, what it really is about, right? While the North Star metric and the vision are super broad and allow you to open up your minds and be super creative, there are way too many choices to contribute to the North Star metric. So we're looking through strategy as one artifact that helps us to make these choices, right? So that we don't feel lost like a little kid in the candy store, overwhelmed by all the choices we could make, but we want these guardrails. And like so often, I found myself going back to smarter people on the internet who already defined very valid parts about these different attributes. And this time I turned to Roger Martin, who, from my experience, or from my perspective, really sums it up quite nicely when he said, well, strategy really is about an integrated set of choices, right? I think that's one of the key bits for me, that all the various ingredients of strategy, they have to be integrated and coherent. And you, of course, you want to make these choices so you win on a playing field. And we will take a look at what could a playing field look like. And you want to make these choices in regards to the vision and the goals. Again, super neat and summarized. And these 4 key bits in there really serve as a great reminder, no matter the strategy framework you're using, it's like, what is my strategy supposed to do? It's supposed to be integrated set of choices across different key criteria that allow me to win. And now I'm not here to touch any new strategy frameworks with you. I think the internet has more than enough strategy frameworks out there. Instead, I find myself really just trying to look at the common denominator across all the different strategy works out there. And I think there are certain patterns when it comes to product strategy, right? And this is not meant to be a conclusive list or like a template or a canvas you have to fill out. This is just a range of options to talk about when you talk about product strategy, right? You can talk about the vision, the values, the principles, things like the North Star metrics. You can and should be explicit about the user or the buyer segments you're going after, what kind of jobs you're trying to solve for them, what kind of alternatives are suddenly popping up there, right? Who are you compared against? Who's your value proposition compared against? How do you plan to distribute it? How do you plan to differentiate? More or less, depending on your product, these are the loose patterns you want to pay attention to when it comes to product strategy. And the thing I want to take a closer look at is how these different choices really influence each other, because it's about this coherence and these the integration we talked about earlier, right? So if we reuse mindful movement, and you might find that some parts of your strategy change more often than others, which is fine. Like, you don't want to change your product vision every quarter. You also don't want to rethink your values over and over again. These things are rather stable parts of your product strategy. So we have that parents want to feel like confident athletes about approaching physical challenges, which is the product vision for this mental health product for mindful movement. And the other value, maybe other values, and maybe the North Star metric. But now you could make various choices about the segments to go after. Maybe you say, well, we particularly focus on parents of the 1-year-old children, because they might struggle. They are looking to make progress, which is what a job really is about. Progress for them would mean I can feel fit without feeling guilty about not spending time with my kids when I'm exercising. That's a job they're trying to get solved, potentially. I knew I have been when my son was 1 year old. The other parts then would be, okay, if I go after this audience and this job, who am I up against? Who am I compared against? And that's why I like the word alternatives way better than competitors, because you're not just up against Headspace or any other Freeletics apps. You're competing against, well, I can also play with my children. That's an alternative choice I can make. Or parent sports groups, which meet offline for some interesting exercises. And so if I do that, of course, I then have to think about, okay, if I go after parents of 1-year-old children, maybe my distribution channel for my product could be parenting influencers, because that's how I can reach them. Maybe I have to differentiate. I could differentiate by something hard to scale. Maybe I try to arrange play dates to find time for yourself. Right? Maybe that's a differentiator compared to the parent sports groups, which sits somewhere, to be honest, between like, is it a value proposition or differentiation? Up for discussion. The key bit is, can you articulate why your solution should be chosen over the other alternatives? And here's how this shifts. While the vision and the principles might stay the same, you maybe decide, well, I want to go after a different market. I want to go after a different audience. So suddenly you're no longer going after parents for 1-year-old children, but parents of teenagers, right? Who might find themselves in the midst of a midlife crisis. And now they're like, my job is, the job I want to get done is I want to tackle completely new physical challenges for self-fulfillment to combat the midlife crisis. That's a completely different job than trying to stay fit without feeling guilty. And suddenly you have different competitors, because one way you could do that, like, well, if I watch sports enough, I'm inspired enough. Like I certainly feel inspired when I watch Ironmans. Doesn't mean I'm even close to doing one. Or you just use any kind of generalized headspace meditation programs to stay mentally fit and prepare myself to combat the midlife crisis. These are other alternatives. But then you also think about, okay, how could I reach these people? Maybe I suddenly have to book ads for Super Bowl or Ironman World Championships. I no longer care about parenting influencers. I need these people. I want to reach these people. And maybe the differentiation would be, well, you get access to athletes who've done it. Right? You can get access to the people who've done that for inspiration. And that's just one example of multiple options. And you can do that when you check your product strategy yourself. How coherent and integrated are your choices? Do you change your audience? Are the jobs the same? Are the ways you want them to make progress the same? Are you aware of the new competitors you're up against? Are you aware of how you're planning to differentiate? So strategy is about these integrated choices, and something that's very easily forgotten. Now, why did I tell you this? Of course, I told you this to set us up for the last part of the sandwich, to talk about OKRs and how OKRs really tie into that. I hopefully already could make the case how the North Star metric and its close integration with the product vision fit into that as like this influencing, inspiring force to the strategy. But now, of course, it's what's the value of a perfectly crafted strategy that you're not implementing? It's probably close to zero, right? So let's talk about that. The key aspect for arriving at OKRs, goals in general, that help you to implement your product strategy is to basically trying to predict the future. And here's how you could do this. You really want to think ahead. Right? You have the strategic choice on the left hand side. So you settled on a specific option along the lines of these strategy patterns I just talked about, whether it's the audience, the jobs, the distribution, the value prop, the differentiation, all the fun stuff, right? That's how you settled on. And the proxy metric essentially tries to answer to you, well, how would you know that you have won, right? Because that's what the strategy choice is about, to win in the market, the playing field you've chosen. Like, how do you know that this worked? That's what the proxy metric is about. So you want to imagine, well, if this strategy choice plays out, how do I know? How would I know? Right? So let's continue to look at this example from mindful movement. And I brought with you also as an example, I brought with me the company example, the company perspective, and we can look at filling in the blanks of the mental fitness product ourselves. But from the company perspective, maybe another strategy choice the company makes is, well, we want to expand beyond the in-app exercise. We want to meet different segments wherever they are of our users, physically or mentally. Maybe lagging proxy metrics could be, well, they have very fit people, the most ambitious users they have. They have completed 2 workouts in 1 local partner studio, right? This would tell them that they managed to expand beyond the in-app fitness and manage to meet their customers wherever they are. Or they have a certain brand association as a fitness app that is maybe a little bit lower, right? Because they don't just want to be perceived as a fitness app. And if we look at the strategy choice that the mental health product made, is that they say, well, we want to enable parents of teenagers, as we talked about, to tackle more ambitious physical challenges by preparing them mentally to step outside their comfort zone through inspiring mental fitness content and programs. That's the value proposition for this job, for this audience. That's a very oversimplified strategy choice. What kind of lagging proxy metrics could you imagine could tell this team, the product team at Mindful Movement, if this strategy has worked? Feel free to drop them in the chat. How would you know that you managed to enable parents of teenagers to tackle more ambitious challenges? Spend at least 1 hour a day doing an exercise. Yeah, potentially. What else comes to mind? How would you know? that they were mentally prepared to step outside their comfort zone. Increasing levels of exercises completed, yeah, maybe. Trend in usage. Registered for in-app exercise instruction, yeah. More complicated courses, yeah. Lots of different options. And of course, we don't really know the product, right? So it's difficult to really establish one. Here's what I was thinking of. I would think of things like, well, maybe if there is certain, like if they have established a certain share, a certain routine, a certain cadence of meditation, of mindfulness exercises in a certain row, they managed to achieve a certain streak, that could tell us that they would do that. Or probably even more indicating would be, well, starting to measure a certain mental readiness score, and you want to aim to get a certain mental readiness score, indicating you that you have like that you are driving the people who are ready to take on these new physical challenges. Some examples, again, for your product will look vastly different, but the key question is, how would you know that the strategy choice has worked in the form of a metric? But now the problem is, it's probably in the name, like these are lagging proxy metrics. So these are very often metrics that change at a rather slow pace. These might work great for department level key results or annual team key results or company key results. They typically don't work that well for team level weekly, bi-weekly check-ins to see if the metric has moved, which is what you actually need, right? You don't just want to have feedback on your strategy progress once a quarter, you want it more often. And that's a great concept to, basically you're trying to go from a lagging indicator to a leading indicator, which by no means new terms. But this summarization by Thomas Christensen, who wrote a great article on this topic, is what he basically says, look, essentially the mindset you have to adopt to figure out what is a good leading indicator is you try to correlate feature adoption or usage with a conversion, right? You're basically trying to answer the question, well, if I look at my most successful users, what kind of actions did they take? What features did they adopt? What did they do before they became successful, right? You want to work your way backwards from there. And that's the interesting challenge you can do as a team, which is a great starting point when, for example, you enter your next OKR definition, trying to work backwards and ask yourself this question, what actions do our most successful users take? And of course, success has to be defined in the context of strategic proxy metrics we just talked about. So in this article, Thomas calls this conversion snapshots. And I think that's a great way to put it, because you're trying to reverse engineer, well, which behaviors, which actions did take place leading up to the ultimate success event for the lagging event, and then figuring out what's the pattern, which one can I focus on. So you're trying to ask yourself which behaviors, which actions would someone take? And basically, the more you go to the left, of course, you're trading certainty for more responsive metrics, right? It's about correlation, not causation. But again, that's what we're looking for. We need actionable metrics that correlate with the strategic success we're looking to create to figure out what works. So in this example, maybe let's use this, this lagging metric of the number of inexperienced users meditating 3 times for 6 weeks in a row, right? Maybe we could say, look, if they do this, we are very confident that the strategy of preparing them mentally for new sports adventures or stepping outside their comfort zone has worked. And so you would try to figure out, well, what is happening before people on their path? How does the journey look like for people on their way to meditating 3 times for 6 weeks in a row? One thing is probably, well, they're actually even meditating a 3rd week in a row, right? Whether it's like for 6 weeks, maybe it's just 3 weeks in a row. That's the one important indicator. Or maybe they complete the 2nd meditation in the very 1st week after they started. And even more leading all the way to the left would be, well, if they actually visit the detailed page of a meditation, that would be the first step on this journey, right? So it's, of course, a very responsive metric, but as you see, the more you move to the left, the more difficult it will be to say, well, just because they visited the detailed page of the meditation doesn't mean they will end up meditating 3 times for 6 weeks in a row, right? So what you want to do is you want to measure, you want to figure out how often does something happen. So you could see, okay, visiting the detailed page, that happens quite frequently, but there's no detectable correlation to triggering this and the lagging indicator. But maybe you'd look at things like, well, what's the common denominator? What's the pattern among those people who meditate, complete a 2nd meditation in the 1st week? And maybe you've realized, well, 80% of the people who end up being successful, as in they do the 3 times for 6 weeks in a row, 80% of them, the common denominator is that they completed a 2nd meditation in the 1st week. And suddenly you're like, well, maybe that's a good predictor with a high probability that these people will get to the ultimate lagging event we're having. That could be the conversion snapshot, so to speak, in this context. And again, this will look vastly different for your product, but it's about the attitude. It's like, what's the ultimate lagging event that's in line with our strategy? What is happening on the way to that lagging event? And then understanding which of these is an actual pattern we can rely on and start to measure and start to improve. And so if you would put all these things together into the sandwich and would say, okay, so the North Star metric for this mental health product would be, well, it's the number of anxious users performing the sport or action they felt blocked to do, right? So they overcome the blockage. That's the number you want to grow. The overly simplified version of the product strategy choice would be, we want to guide this mental unblocking content from athletes and experienced coaches. How would you know that you achieved this? As a more tactical key result, as we just tried to reverse engineer, well, it's a certain share of users who complete a second meditation series in the first week. That could be a number to focus on. Or you could also start to establish like a content relevancy feedback from them and figure out, okay, how does that work? Is there certain, if we drive up the relevancy score of the content, is there a high correlation for them to sticking to this routine? So that has been my walkthrough for this idea of how to go from such an inspiring, fluffy, often loosely defined metric like a North Star metric or the product vision, all the way down to something more tangible like the OKRs. I hope that was helpful for you. I'm really looking forward to diving into the Q&A in a bit. Other than that, some contact details. If you want to stay in touch, say hi. If you're interested in the slides, feel free to drop me an email. I'm happy to send them to you as well, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always curious to continue the conversation. And I hope that was valuable for you. I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the questions that might have popped up as a result of this presentation. And thanks again so much for having me. And let's start the conversation, I'd say.
Thanks a lot, Tim. I would welcome everybody now to just freely talk, unmute yourself, show on the camera if you feel like it. Yeah, just to keep this a little bit more lively. I think there was one question. Let me see if I can find that. If you want to ask something, please just raise your hand or unmute yourself. It's perfectly fine. Let me see. Don't seem to find that one anymore.
I think I saw one. Do you think that someone asked, like, how do you quantify and formulate value for customer?
Yeah, exactly. That was the one I was looking for. Yeah. So
yeah, right.
That was the one.
Yeah.
Exactly. How
again,
to
I think
quantify, formulate value.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's a series, like the way I guide teams through this is it's a series of questions. It's not a formula. It's not a template you fill in, right? It's basically ask, like, you want to have this intention, like, what kind of change am I trying to create for the users, for the target audience I'm going after, which again requires the clarity on the vision level, of course. And then you would just simply in the team, like, ask yourself, well, what kind of metrics would tell us that people have been successful, that they have experienced value? That's the open-ended question, right? And then you probably need some course correction, because very often it's easy for teams to default to business metrics, to KPIs, to revenue. All of these don't really represent the value experience by the customer. Just think creatively is the probably unsatisfying, interesting response to that question. But use the other inputs you have for structuring that conversation. Cool. Good to hear that it resonates.
If nobody wants to ask a question, I might jump in here to ask one. I always struggle with leading and lagging metrics when it comes to OKRs. Do you have some good advice there, or some thumb for that? Some tip and tricks for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think mentally, I find myself going back to this like reverse engineering of the lagging indicator. I think it's just, again, it's like putting aside the concept of first of all, of course, you need to have this self-evaluation and understand, okay, do I actually have a lagging or leading indicator? So I think you need to have this awareness, like, hey, the metric we're using, how often does it actually change? How often can we check in on it? Like, of course, that's the first step, the self-evaluation, the self-awareness of the OKRs. And then we're just honestly putting the OKR concept aside almost, and then saying, okay, well, that's the lagging event. We know it's a lagging indicator because it doesn't change it often. And then figuring out, well, what kind of metrics influence this one? Like, you could do this with this reverse customer journey mapping. You could do like driver trees, whatever works, whatever flavor you work. But essentially, you're trying to figure out what are the more what are the drivers of the other metrics that occur more often, or where you can detect the change more often or more frequently. I think that's the mindset. And then just like lining them up and building these logical orders at first as the first recommendation. Then I would go through each of these. Okay, how often does it actually occur? Can we measure it? And like do the work through these sanity checks. And really just, again, the simple question would be, if you know someone is coming up with a metric and you know it's a lagging indicator, just ask themselves, well, what kind of metric is driving this metric? They're just trying to do that, or what actions do users have to take so this metric can grow? That's how I typically approach it. And then the rest is facilitation, magic, and patience.
Thank you for that. Any other questions from the room? So can you elaborate more on the quarterly OKR planning, and how do you align this with the deliverable on the roadmap?
Yeah, interesting. Of course, so much stuff to unpack, as in what type of roadmap, what type of OKRs, company, team level, like all these different variables and flavors. So that's difficult to give you the one-pointed answer. I think I see like goals and OKRs and roadmaps sort of like on eye level. They influence each other. So sometimes certain roadmap projects might just take longer than a quarter, so the cadence doesn't line up. So it might make sense, okay, can I use OKRs to structure the progress or the work on this kind of initiative that's still ongoing? On the other hand, quote unquote, in the ideal situation, you might start with the OKR, with the outcome, with the key result, and then you ask yourself, how might I drive the key result? And this then leads to roadmap items. And then you want to make sure that your roadmap items are connected to OKRs. That's something I would definitely pay attention to, that you say, whatever your roadmap item is, whatever flavor or structure you use, that you at least make sure that roadmap items are connected to OKRs, whether it's definitely to the objective, maybe even to the key result, even if you have more like discovery, like explorative OKRs, to make sure that these are linked to a new exploration of a new strategic initiative. So, and then you can, on the roadmap, then you can have discovery activities or more like testing activities, however you want to call it or describe it. That's how I see that. Again, make sure you form a connection. Ideally, the goal comes before the deliverable. I know that's not always the practical reality for most people. So focus on the connection and maybe using that as maybe a lens to say, okay, maybe the roadmap item doesn't make sense because we have clearly different OKRs. That's how I would see it.
Thank you. So we have another couple of questions. So Marco was asking, can you comment on balancing leading versus lagging indicators? I think you kind of addressed that already, but you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short summary is, I think, again, if you, aside from all the other stuff, ideally, in order to have OKRs that are useful to a team, they have to be influenceable and the change has to be detectable. So I think the more leading in OKRs, the higher the chances of the key result being actually useful to the product team. I think on a, let's say, if a team works with annual OKRs, if you have department or company OKRs, you can easily get away with lagging indicators because they don't have to change that often. They don't have to provide as much feedback. But from a team level, I would always try to aim for leading indicators so they allow you to measure progress throughout the quarter.
Thank you. Now, Gul is asking, do you have any specific favorite authors or resources you can recommend to further explore this topic?
Yeah. The question is, what do you mean with this topic? I would say in the broader context, I think, yeah, Marco just posted some of the usual suspects. Personally, again, yeah, I really like Christina Wodtke, particularly her book, Radical Focus, which I think is one of the most entertaining reads on OKRs for sure. There's some other good reads out there. I think the issue I oftentimes have is that you either find people who are purely OKR focused and don't have a good sense for the practical application of the product context, or it's just like pure Scrum kind of thingy, dogmatic perspective. I think the truth always lies in the middle, which is what motivates me to do most of my writing. But yeah, Christina Wodtke is certainly a safe bet. I think that a couple of other underestimated people, like the gentleman I quoted in the article, Thomas Christensen, who wrote this great article, this great, insanely practical article about identifying a leading indicator. He's not a product guru nor an OKR coach, but he provided very great, helpful insights to make the concept more tangible. Again, another person I like to read is, of course, I like to follow Lenny's newsletter and Lenny's Slack. Not so much, Lenny doesn't write themselves as much, doesn't write that much himself, which is fine, but the aggregation he provides, the insights he provides, and how other companies are doing that, I found that to be fascinating. He had a great articles on how Figma uses OKRs or how Coda uses OKRs. I think that's more interesting as well, to dive into how other people are doing things. Yeah. I think there was also one question, right, of the applying that in personal development.
Yes, exactly. Apologies,
Yeah.
I was on mute.
Yeah, all good. Yeah, I mean, sort of. So I'm not a fan of like OKRs, like individual OKRs in company environments. I think that doesn't really make sense if you have team or department OKRs, but that's a different topic. I can tell you like N=1 experience, as in I run my business of one with artifacts like a vision and offsite metric and OKRs. So I go through that for myself. I balance like the business-oriented OKRs, which are not always influenceable for me, simply because client relationships, client dependencies. So sometimes I focus more on what you could call output OKRs, or like certain establishing habits, changing the way I work, is something I like to do a lot, which helps me, because if I have certain behavior systems in place for my OKRs, I trust that the results will follow. But I also have key results around course usage, newsletter subscription, content consumption, that kind of stuff. So I think it always works. The thing I can tell you from my experience is that I think it's 100 times easier to help others with their OKRs or their strategy creation than to do it for yourself. I think like having this external force, this external perspective who nudges you, to support you, looking a little bit beyond the usual thinking, that can be incredibly helpful. So even if you do it for yourself, ask a friend to give him or her a list of prompts, of typical OKR prompts, and then just have them challenge you on some of the work you did. So I think it can work really, really well. But again, the power of something like OKRs is, of course, in the routines, in the weekly check-in, in the reflection, in the review, and the continuous iteration, like so many practices.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. I think that's it for questions. I don't see anything else. I really can't thank him enough for being here tonight. I think this was a great session for everybody to learn more about OKRs.
Nice.
I'm particularly very deep into that topic now, so for me, it's always good to hear about it.
Cool.
And yeah, otherwise, I can also only advise, follow Tim, have a look at his website. There's a lot of interesting content there, a lot of small videos, and with a lot of information. And otherwise, thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Thanks, Tim, again. And yeah. We will share the recording, so if you want to hear about it again, feel free.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for having me. Make sure to stay in touch. Have a great evening, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.